how only 800 Vikings humiliated an army of 40,000 feudal warriors. Sign up now for more true stories that reveal epic battles and moments that changed the course of humanity. Sign up now for more historical documentaries that reveal epic battles and hidden secrets from the past. In the far north of Europe, where the wind cuts the skin like blades of ice, and the sea races on grey walls, a people destined to mark history by courage and ferocity was born, the Vikings. Far beyond the simplified image of barbarian marauders, they were skilled navigators, cunning strategists, and warriors shaped by an environment so hostile that survival itself became daily training for war. Among all the stories surrounding these Northmen, one stands out for challenging the most basic logic of war: the day when some 800 Vikings faced, defeated, and humiliated a feudal army that numbered approximately 40,000 warriors. To understand the dimension of this confrontation, it is necessary to go back in time and see the scenario of medieval Europe. It was an era of castles, landlords, peasants, bound by the obligation to serve, and a network of loyalties that sustained the feudal system. A lord's strength was measured by the size of his army and the number of men he could summon in the event of war. The more spears, the more swords, the more shields, the greater his security seemed to be. The general belief was simple: numbers win battles. If a kingdom could muster tens of thousands of warriors, any threat from outside would be overwhelmed by the sheer number of soldiers willing to fight. But while the feudal lords relied on the illusion of great numbers, in the frozen north another kind of power was forged. The Vikings grew up in villages exposed to brutal, cold, rough seas and lands where nothing was guaranteed. From childhood, they learned to row, hunt, build, fight, and endure pain. There was no room for weakness. Norse culture celebrated courage above all else, and death in battle was seen as an honorable passage, not a tragic end. Each warrior was trained to act with initiative, think fast, and fight with maximum intensity, from the first to the last second. When the first Viking ships began to venture beyond the known shores, the southern feudal kingdoms did not immediately understand what they were up against. At first glance, they looked like mere bands of marauders who arrived, pillaged, and left. But over time, it became clear that these attacks were not simply outbursts of disorganized violence. They followed patterns, took advantage of tides, rivers, fog, guard schedules, and weaknesses in defenses. Instead of marching slowly along predictable roads, the Vikings glided silently along rivers that cut through the heart of the kingdoms, springing up where no one imagined they could reach. It was in one of these bold moves that 800 Vikings approached, a feudal territory that was especially rich and proud of its military strength. Local leaders trusted their troops. They could summon thousands of men, mobilize knights, archers, spearmen, and peasant militias. In the eyes of these authorities, 800 men were not a real threat, but an opportunity. Defeating them would mean consolidating prestige, imposing respect, and reinforcing the idea that no one could challenge that power without paying a very high price. Arrogance, however, is a silent enemy. Instead of uniting under a clear command, many feudal lords clashed over who would lead the military response, who would receive credit for the victory, and what portion of the loot would go to each. This internal rivalry delayed important decisions, fragmented strategies, and weakened the army's discipline. Meanwhile, the Vikings watched. They measured distances, counted guards, assessed reaction times, studied geography, and waited patiently for the perfect moment to strike. As the days passed, the great feudal army grew in number, but not in efficiency. Poorly trained peasants were placed alongside veteran soldiers, Quality weapons were mixed with improvised spears. Contradictory orders circulated among the ranks. Many were there out of obligation, not conviction. Their hearts did not burn with the desire for glory, but with fear and weariness. In contrast, each of the 800 Vikings knew exactly why they were there. They would face whatever came, and if they had to die, they would do so with their heads held high, certain that they would be inscribed in the memory of their people. On the day chosen by the Vikings, dawn brought with it a thick fog that spread across the countryside like a cloak of mystery. For the feudal army, it was just a difficulty of visibility. To the Vikings, she was an ally. They positioned themselves strategically, occupying high ground, narrow crossing points, and areas where the movement of large formations would be difficult. His intention was not to face all 40,000 men at once. Their goal was to break the giant into manageable pieces, disorganize, demoralize, and defeat the enemy through surgical blows. The initial attack was devastating. Without warning, groups of Vikings advanced with coordinated violence against the most vulnerable flanks of the feudal army. Heavy blades met misplaced shields, lamed spears pierced ill-fitting armor, and war cries echoed with an intensity that surpassed the physical and directly struck at the opponent's psyche. For many hastily summoned peasants, this was their first real experience of battle, and it began with a shock so brutal that any initial confidence melted into panic. Feudal leaders tried to fight back, but the structure that appeared to be solid proved fragile under pressure. Orders were slow to arrive. Messengers were lost in the tumult. Whole units did not know whether to advance, retreat, or hold position. The Vikings used this to their advantage. They advanced, retreated, changed direction, created the illusion of being present in much greater numbers than they really were. While the feudal army sought to form large lines of combat, the Norse attacked in smaller, fast groups, focused on destroying local leaderships, banners, and points of communication. Feudal cavalry, seen as one of the main weapons of that army, was also intelligently neutralized. Taking advantage of the rugged terrain and some narrow passages, the Vikings created natural traps. Riders who tried to charge with full force found themselves trapped in spaces where horses could not gain speed or maneuver freely. At these locations, Vikings advanced with axes, short swords, and spears, knocking down mounts and turning powerful knights into disoriented fighters, caught in the middle of hand-to-hand combat for which they were not prepared. As the hours of combat progressed, something even more dangerous than fatigue spread among the feudal ranks. Fear. It was no longer just the fear of death, but the fear of the inexplicable. How could such a large army be constantly being pressured by such a small group? How was it possible that, no matter how many reinforcements were sent to a front, the feeling of disorganization continued to grow? Rumors arose amid the confusion. Some said that the Vikings numbered more than 10,000. Others swore that they possessed supernatural powers, and still others simply believed that they were destined for defeat. As the panic expanded like an inkblot, the Vikings remained focused. Each local victory was quickly seized. Whenever a feudal group retreated, they advanced to occupy the space, cutting supply lines, preventing reorganizations, and turning tactical retreats into full routes. In various sectors of the battlefield, small nuclei of feudal warriors ended up isolated, not knowing where to flee and without receiving new orders. The dominant sensation was no longer of combat, but of collapse. By the time the feudal leaders finally realized that the situation had gotten out of hand, it was too late. They could still count on tens of thousands of men, but these men were no longer an army. They were astonished, exhausted, and divided individuals reacting in an uncoordinated way to attacks that seemed to come from all sides. Unlike idealized movies and stories, many historical battles do not end with a last heroic clash, but with something simpler and more humiliating: the escape. And that's exactly what happened. Many of those who made up the great feudal army simply abandoned the countryside. The result was a defeat that surpassed any calculation of material losses. It was not just a military failure, it was a shake in the self-esteem of an entire social structure. A supposedly invincible army sustained by impressive numbers had been disbanded by 800 men whose greatest weapon was the combination of extreme courage, tactical discipline, combat experience, and a mentality that knew no word surrender. That day became a milestone, an example repeated in chronicles, short stories, and later analyses as a demonstration that numerical superiority alone does not guarantee any victory. The story of these 800 Vikings against 40,000 feudal warriors echoed for centuries to come as a wake-up call. Kings, generals, and strategists began to look more carefully at the value of cohesion, efficient leadership, rigorous training, and real motivation of soldiers. Many have begun to understand that a huge, poorly led, poorly coordinated army can be more fragile than a small force, fully united around a clear purpose. But the deep understanding of this event does not end on the battlefield. It continues when we observe the long-term consequences. After the defeat, many feudal chroniclers tried to minimize the impact of that day by omitting details or reducing the importance of the Vikings in protecting the honor of their lords. However, the accounts that have survived, even filtered through shame, still indicate the tone of astonishment and incredulity that dominated the accounts of the time. It was hard for anyone to admit that so much force had been rooted by so few. Modern scholars, observing this episode from a distance, identify a central point: mentality. Feudal warriors fought mainly out of duty, obligation, and fear of the punishments that came with desertion. Many were hastily summoned, taken out of their routines, and pushed to the battlefield without psychological preparation. The Vikings, on the other hand, didn't just accept war. They were looking for it. For many of them, entering combat was the realization of an ideal of life. They trained for that moment, were proud of him, and stared at him with a mixture of coolness and enthusiasm that shocked their opponents. Another decisive factor was the way the leadership acted on each side. In the feudal army, the most important commanders, often high-ranking nobles, could be more concerned with prestige, personal and internal disputes than with the effectiveness of the whole. They saw their soldiers almost as numbers on a board, replaceable pieces that existed to ensure the maintenance of their social positions. Among the Vikings, leadership was exercised closely. Warlords fought side by side with their men, sharing risks, food, cold, and blood. This closeness created bonds of trust that could not be copied by those who commanded from a distance. The very idea of failure was also viewed in a totally different way by the two sides. For a feudal lord, losing a battle could mean loss of land, status, alliances, and even legitimacy. It was a political disaster. For a Viking leader, even a defeat could be turned into history and learning, as long as it was marked by courage to the end. This way of thinking lessened the weight of fear and increased the willingness to perform risky maneuvers that, although dangerous, could generate extraordinary results when well executed. By studying in detail how 800 warriors managed to dismantle 40,000, one can also realize the importance of the terrain. The Vikings did not choose the battle position by chance. They preferred locations that limited the mobility of enemy forces, preventing large blocks of soldiers from acting at the same time. By turning a mass battle into a sequence of reduced confrontations, they leveled the scales. So, instead of facing 40,000 at once, they faced 300 here, 400 there, 1,000 at another point, always looking for the imbalance and collapse of isolated segments of the larger army. This type of tactical thinking is still studied today in military academies and in strategic analysis of various fields. Even outside the war context, the idea of fragmenting a big problem into smaller parts of attacking weak points instead of blindly attacking the greatest. Concentration of force is a principle that goes beyond the battlefield and applies to politics, economics, management, and even personal life. The history of the 800 Vikings is not just historical curiosity. It offers lessons on focus, positioning, courage, and situational intelligence. Meanwhile, the Vikings' reputation expanded. Peoples who had previously seen them only as marauders began to fear the mere possibility of a fleet coming from the north approaching their coasts or their rivers. In many places, the news that Viking ships had been sighted was enough to create panic even before any hostile movement. It wasn't just the violence that made them feared, but the notion that they were unpredictable, disciplined, and capable of feats thought impossible. Over time, some kingdoms adapted, fortifications were strengthened, coastal defenses were reorganized, and greater attention was paid to the speed of response in the face of sudden threats. In some cases, even agreements were made, taxes were paid, and pacts were signed to avoid direct confrontations. The shadow of what happened in that particular battle contributed to shaping these changes. The defeat of the 40,000 became a silent symbol of warning. Ignoring intelligence and preparation in the name of blind trust in numbers was a mistake that no one wanted to repeat. By looking at this history through the eyes of the present, it is also possible to perceive the importance of the narrative. Whoever tells the story shapes the way it is remembered. For a long time, the Vikings were portrayed simplistically as violent brutes driven only by instinct. But the more one studies their expeditions, their naval technologies, their social structures, and their way of waging war, the clearer it becomes that there was a lot of calculation behind each successful attack. The victory of the 800 over the 40,000 was not a stroke of luck, but the result of a precise combination of human, cultural, and strategic factors. Every detail reinforces the same conclusion. The real strength in that battle was not on the side that had the most men, the most flags, and the most titles, but the side that had the most cohesion, the most clarity of purpose, and the greatest ability to act in unison. Those Norse warriors, often seen as barbaric foreigners by their enemies, proved to be masters of the art of war on a level that few of the time could comprehend. And so, as the generations passed, the story lived on, crossing the centuries like an insistent whisper that says, never underestimate a small group of highly committed people. The numbers can impress, they can intimidate, they can fill reports and speeches of power, but at the moment of the real confrontation, it is the quality of the preparation, the solidity of the relationships of trust, and the determination of the individuals that define the outcome. The 800 Vikings who faced 40,000 feudal warriors did not know that they would one day be studied in books, documentaries, and historical, and they just did what they believed to be their duty and their destiny. They threw themselves into battle with inflamed hearts, sharp minds, and the certainty that, no matter what, they would leave a mark. And they did. Long after their guns have rusted and their ships have disappeared, their deeds are still told, reviewed, and admired. This is the legacy that remains, the reminder that it is not the size of the army, but the spirit of the warriors that determines what is recorded in history. in every account, in every analysis, in every new way of telling this episode. The journey of those 800 warriors remains relevant. It reminds us that in any battle of life, the way we prepare, who we walk with, and how much we believe in the purpose that guides us define more than any cold statistics. Subscribe to more documentaries like this and keep exploring true stories that challenge logic, fear, and the very idea of the impossible.